Where is everybody? What actually happened to the Fulgorans? Fulgora is a desolate desert drenched in heavy oil. During the day, sunlight is minimal, and at night it's beset by a continuous lightning storm. The engineer discovers the remnants of an ancient civilization, their strange buildings fallen into ruin, the inhabitants long gone. Why is there lightning, but no rain? As someone who lives in the UK, I'm used to lightning being associated with rain. Here, thunderstorms are always wet, with rain falling at the same time. But you learn something new every day, and it turns out that thunderstorms can also be dry. And these dry thunderstorms produce dry lightning, where lightning strikes without any rain hitting the ground. Dry thunderstorms arise when the lower levels of the atmosphere are very dry, and the rain that falls actually evaporates before it hits the ground. This is apparently very common in deserts, and dry thunderstorms also happen a lot in the American West, where there are a particular problem for causing wildfires. The mechanisms for the thunderstorms on Fulgora could therefore be the same as it is on Earth. Hot air rises, carrying moisture that condenses out as it cools. This forms water drops that eventually crystallize into ice. These ice crystals knock into each other, and the static charge this creates builds up and eventually discharges to the land as lightning. The ice crystals steadily coalesce and become too big to stay afloat. They drop, melting to become rain, but that rain never hits the ground as it evaporates before it gets there. I'm not sure there could be a better description of Fulgora. It's a super dry desert world. The small amount of sunlight heats the sand, causing what water vapour there is to rise during the day. The rising air cools as it hits the higher parts of the atmosphere, creating a cycle. The air moves away from the hotter daylight areas towards the cooler night zones. Here, it cools to the point where water condenses and forms crystals in a large, permanent and stable nighttime cloud bank. As these water crystals grow, they become heavier, descending and knocking against each other even more. This generates huge amounts of static electricity and creates a continuous storm. This storm travels around the planet, locked into the night, shedding what little moisture it has as rain. But the lower atmosphere is so dry, it evaporates and never actually hits the ground. Instead, all we see are the lightning strikes, discharging the built-up static electricity. Which is kinda cool, in a depressing sort of way. And why is the sand drenched in heavy oil? I think the basis for this one is relatively easy to understand. Fulgora is a world that used to have an intelligent species, capable of building structures. If we look at the Fulgorans' walls, we'll see a lot of these outlets. The outlets show traces of liquids having been poured out and staining the wall underneath them. I think it's no coincidence that these always lead out into an area of desert, and that desert is polluted with heavy oil. Clearly the two are related. Whatever the Fulgorans were dumping out of these outlets is, or has become, the heavy oil that we can extract today. Of course, there's a few possibilities as to what the Fulgorans were actually dumping. Firstly, I wonder if the Fulgoran planet has always been a desert. If it used to be a planet where there were rivers and lakes and oceans, then perhaps these outlets were for waste disposal that way. We do the same, dumping our waste into the water, where it must stop being a problem because the water takes it away. Of course, what they were dumping is an interesting question in and of itself. While crude oil is actually a complex mix of hydrocarbons, Factorio's heavy oil, light oil and petroleum gas are actually a relatively good proxy. So if the heavy oil of Fulgora came from crude oil, then how did this crude oil form? Well, crude oil on Earth is usually produced by the remnants of ancient algae and microbial life that lived in the oceans and drifted to the seabed when they died. There, it's covered in sediment and, across millions of years, geological processes transform it into crude oil. It eventually then becomes so concentrated in porous rocks that we can extract it using drilling. No, oil is not dead dinosaurs. It's obviously possible that, millions of years ago, the Fulgoran planet had seas and was producing crude oil in the same way. The Fulgorans then drilled and exploited it in the way we do. The heavy oil could therefore be a byproduct of them drilling crude and only using the petroleum and light oil components. In other words, it's possible that they never developed the oil cracking technology that we use. But it seems more likely they just had so much crude oil and were so wasteful as a species, they simply dumped all that heavy oil. I mean, perhaps they struggled as much with blue science and managing oil production as the rest of us. Another possibility of the source of all this heavy oil is that it is a byproduct of their industry. Given the impression that the scrap and polluted sand give off of a wasteful species that didn't care about destroying its environment, they could just have dumped the pollution without caring, even if that seems suicidal. I mean, what sort of species would do something so short-sighted? But there is another option, which is perhaps supported by the look of the outlets. It could be sewage. This would perhaps explain why the Fulgorans were dumping heavy oil, since it's a useful resource. They weren't. It's just that over the millennia that it's been there, it has slowly transformed into heavy oil. Or something close to heavy oil that the engineer can use in the same way anyway. Weirdly, I think this is actually my favourite explanation, as there's actually a bit of a theme of poop-related stuff in the expansion. In particular, the Pentapod biology basically tells us they are pooping flying bugs at us. Yep, I believe we are mining a planet of ancient poop. Why isn't everything on fire? One of my channel members, PT Dog, pointed out to me that it's a bit weird that everything isn't on fire on Fulgora. I mean, we have a sand that's soaked in heavy oil, and we have lightning strikes. Surely all that lightning would keep setting the oil on fire. Their suggested explanation was that there's no free oxygen in Fulgora's atmosphere. The comment was actually on my What is the Engineer video, so the point was actually that the engineer doesn't need oxygen. But it does make sense as an explanation for there being no fires as well. Perhaps in the past there were so many fires started by the lightning that it turned all of the oxygen into carbon dioxide. Of course, the problem with this is that there are fires on Fulgora. Burner technology works, and you can use a flamethrower. But look what happens when we use the flamethrower on the oil sand. It doesn't start some huge fire that sweeps across the planet, it just goes out. So, while I do think the amount of free oxygen in Fulgora's atmosphere is low, I think that actually the oil is not very flammable. And this isn't unrealistic. Diesel is an example of a flammable oil that has a very high ignition point. To use it in diesel engines, it's compressed, which lowers the ignition point. Although note that diesel actually burns in an engine rather than exploding, which is why it produces such horrible emissions. The heavy oil in Factorio could have a similarly high ignition temperature. When combined with a low level of atmospheric oxygen, this is why the place isn't constantly on fire. When did the lightning start? In case it wasn't obvious, I don't think that the oil sand and the lightning strikes are the natural state of Fulgora. That is, I think the actions of the Fulgorans caused both. They made Fulgora like that through their actions, and the world they originally evolved on was much more hospitable to life. How close it was to being a Gleber or an Alvis, which are veritably drowning in organic life, be that plants, animals, fish or fungus, I'm not sure. Given it's a colder, dimmer world, evolution was probably slower, but that's no reason to doubt that Fulgora had lots of diverse species. It clearly had the capacity to evolve and support intelligent life, since that's what the Fulgorans were. We see ruins on Fulgora that are clearly suggestive of machines and technology. They're not stuck at the wood huts and clay brick stage. The scrap has processing units, low-density structures, and various other things that we consider high up in the engineer's tech tree. Anyway, the point of all this is that I think the Fulgorans evolved on a planet without these continuous lightning storms. As they became more technologically advanced and more industrial, they polluted and boiled away their oceans. This resulted in the continuous lightning storm, but I don't think this lightning storm led to the Fulgorans' downfall. And the reason I don't think that is the lightning attractors. These things are dotted throughout the Fulgoran ruins, and they're clearly still doing their job all these years later. The Fulgorans may even have used them to harness the lightning like the engineer does. But the point is that the lightning doesn't appear to have been the cause of the downfall of the Fulgorans. What were the Fulgorans? In all the scenarios I've outlined, it could have been that the Fulgorans were dumping their waste into water. Over time, their seas dried up, or they used up the water in their industrial processes, leaving a sandy wasteland. The other option is that if it wasn't a watery planet, then they were simply dumping the waste onto the sand. I guess the real difference here is that if it's processed crude oil, then this would suggest the planet used to have oceans, and this would fit with the Fulgorans being organic. Or, if it's poop, then this also suggests they were organic. If it's purely an industrial runoff, then this opens up the possibility that the Fulgorans were inorganic. In other words, maybe the Fulgorans could have been robots. Not that I'm obsessed with robots. In my previous video, asking what the engineer is, I came to the definitive, objectively factual conclusion that the engineer is a monster, a robot, with either an AI or an uploaded organic consciousness. Could the Fulgorans have been the same? It's obviously possible, and there's very little to support either argument. However, even if they ended up as some sort of virtual being with robotic bodies, or perhaps got wiped out by their AI servants, I do think that they would have started out as organic creatures. In the Factorio universe, there is clearly organic life. The 3 inner planets all have life on them. There's no real sense of anything mechanical, from Fulgoran colonies for example, ever having been on the other planets until the engineer arrives. And I don't think a mechanical form of life can develop naturally without there having been an organic life to create them. Gears and circuit boards can't evolve naturally. What happened on Fulgora? Okay, so here's my theory. Fulgora was a cold, dark world, but one with naturally occurring liquid water. Complex life evolved there, resulting in a sentient species, the Fulgorans, who developed advanced technology and automated industry. This technology was of a similar level to that used by the engineer. However, the Fulgorans had little regard for their own natural environment, polluting and damaging their planet. This resulted in the complete loss of their seas, leaving behind a sand heavily polluted with organic materials. Their actions also led to the creation of a permanent night storm that ravaged the land with lightning strikes. To cope, the Fulgorans developed lightning attractors that also enabled them to harness the power of the lightning. But the loss of the seas was catastrophic. Life could not survive on a planet with no liquid water. Their animals and plants died. And I think that leads us to talking about where the Fulgorans are now. Where are the Fulgorans now? I think there's a couple of basic and fairly obvious possibilities. 1, they've gone extinct, or 2, they left Fulgora. Extinction. As I've outlined, I think the Fulgorans destroyed their planet with pollution and made it uninhabitable. A self-caused extinction is therefore the most obvious answer based on the scenario I've outlined. But it's not the only possibility. For instance, there could have been some natural disaster like a meteor strike. But it could also have been that the planet wasn't able to sustain its seas for very long. Mars is a very good example of this. It almost certainly had liquid water for a portion of its life, but it's now a barren, frozen wasteland. Reminds me of somewhere. If there is water on Mars, then it's probably trapped as ice at the poles. Note that we get ice from the scrap on Fulgora. But this isn't because some ancient species messed the place up. It's probably because Mars just isn't able to retain water. Firstly, it's a lot smaller than Earth, so its gravity is a lot lower. That might sound like a weird point to make, but atoms and molecules are just as subject to gravity as anything else. If a planet is too small, then it doesn't have an atmosphere because gases can escape into space. Mars' core is also now solid, which means it doesn't have a magnetic field. Our magnetic field is a result of our liquid iron core. That gives it much less protection from solar winds, which strip away the atmosphere, including any water vapour. These both result in a thin atmosphere on Mars, and therefore a low atmospheric pressure. And it's our atmospheric pressure that helps to keep water liquid on Earth's surface. So yeah, Fulgora could simply have lost its liquid water, but I think it's more likely the Fulgorans did it. Losing water in this way would not have been quick. If the Fulgorans had become advanced, they'd surely have realised and done something about it. They could have built domes, for example, and maybe preserved water underground. It doesn't seem credible to me that they'd just let themselves die out. Another possibility is a war. Perhaps the Fulgorans were a particularly warlike species and ended up destroying themselves. Or perhaps it was an interstellar conflict. There's no real evidence that they fought with intelligent life on the other planets in the Nova system, but I guess that could also be a possibility. The lack of ruins on the other planets could be because they're more biologically active and they got covered over by plant life. I don't know, a war just doesn't seem likely to me. The ruins we see are clearly beaten up, but it looks more like natural decay than because of conflict. And the scale of conflict we'd be talking about would suggest the use of nuclear weapons. And the planet definitely doesn't look like it's been destroyed by nukes. It looks more like the decay you'd get from things like rusting and weathering, wind erosion and the occasional lightning strike. So I'm not the biggest fan of this option. Leaving. A couple of options occur to me. First, maybe their planet became uninhabitable due to the reasons I've just discussed, and collectively, as a species, they abandoned their planet. In other words, as extinction grew more likely, they left. Of course, there's no real way of knowing if this was a collective decision and they all left at the same time, or it was perhaps something smaller scale. But the point is that perhaps they built a fleet of interstellar ships to take them to another system. My problem with this is that it seems a bit weird to get to the point that they realised they were destroying their planet, and then they decided to leave rather than do something about it. I guess it could have been a catastrophic thing. The oceans all disappeared quickly and the lightning suddenly came. But as noted, that doesn't seem to tie up with the lightning collectors. So perhaps they just didn't care enough to try to save Fulgora. I think the real nail in the coffin for this theory is that none of the ruins look like rocket silos. If they're abandoning their planet, then they've got to have some way to do that. And if they're doing it at the scale of their whole species leaving, then rocket silos would surely be all over the place. But we don't see anything like that. Another option is that perhaps only a few Fulgorans believed that they were on the precipice of extinction and it was them that left. This would require much less infrastructure. As such, perhaps there are a handful of rocket silos somewhere on the planet, it's just that we never find them. A planet's a big place after all. But this brings up my other problem with this idea. Why not go to one of the closer planets rather than to another system? There are at least 3 other planets in the Nova system that support organic life, so why not go there? Unless they did, and then the hostile natives wiped them out. I guess at this point I should mention another possibility. Are the biters, Pentapods or Wurms Fulgorans? I've seen this theory in a few places, and obviously there's no way of really knowing. The idea is that the Fulgorans became one of the species on the other planets. Biters, Pentapods, or Wurms. I personally am not a fan of this theory, as the life on the other planets is not in any way technologically advanced. They don't build structures, that is, unless you count the biter nests or egg rafts, but there's no hint of anything inorganic. For this theory to work, the Fulgorans would therefore have had to essentially de-evolve themselves, to abandon all their technology and then, adapt to the new surroundings? I think we can be pretty sure that none of the species we see today are the unchanged Fulgorans. None of the species have hands or anything that would allow them to manipulate tools. Hands would have been necessary to build the structures and scrap materials on Fulgora. If we stick with this theory for now, it's possible they manipulated their own genetics to work on one of these other planets. That way they could have survived in the new environment, but presumably not taken anything with them. I think that if this is the case, it's best supported by the small colonisation idea. I could see some small group realising that they were destroying Fulgora and therefore themselves. Perhaps this group tried to convince others but failed. Maybe they then decided to leave and colonise one of the other planets. To do this, they adjusted their genetic makeup to make them better suited to their new surroundings. What we therefore see is the further evolved version of that. Or maybe they went further and decided to completely adapt to the new environment in such a way that they wouldn't repeat the mistakes of the past. I guess there's one possible bit of evidence for this. On Gleba, there's this odd mark on the planet. Perhaps that's something to do with the Fulgorans. I do think the Pentapods are the most likely Fulgoran descendants. Although it's not represented in the game itself, we know from the Friday facts that the Pentapods are hostile to each other. They apparently fight over territory and access to food, which sounds like the sort of thing the Fulgorans might have done. Of course, the Wurms are territorial, and we've never really had any lore about the biters, so maybe they are too. What I'm saying is I'm not really basing this on anything other than feels. Anyway, I personally don't think that the Gleba scar supports this theory, but I'll be doing a video on that, and the biters, at some point in the future as well. What I think happened. I don't really like the option of the Fulgorans making themselves extinct. It just doesn't make sense. They'd have worked out something was wrong and done something about it. As such, maybe they did leave Fulgora, but if they did, then there's not much evidence of this, either on Fulgora or on other planets in the system, so I'm not sure. But there is a third option. They're still there. This ruin, the one that has a deep hole into the ground, it's called a vault in the game files. What do you keep in a vault? There's a lot of them. Could they be sleeping? Watching? Waiting? After all, No one would have believed that our activities were being watched keenly and closely by intelligences greater than ours. That, as we busied ourselves, we were scrutinised and studied. How, with infinite complacency, we went about our little affairs, serene in our assurance of our empire over matter. No one gave a thought to the older worlds of space as sources of danger, or thought of them only to dismiss the idea of life upon them as impossible or improbable.